So with these modifications that we're going to talk about, we'll be able to take the BRZ to about 210 to 220 wheel horsepower. Hey guys, Jake from 8020 Media here. Today we're talking about performance modifications and upgrades for the Subaru BRZ Scion FR-S Toyota 86. The Subaru BRZ is an extremely fun car to drive because it only weighs about 2,700 pounds. This makes it handle extremely well. It makes it great around the corners. However, in my opinion, where Subaru went wrong with these vehicles is by putting a 2-liter naturally aspirated inline-4 engine into them, which only produces 205 horsepower and 156 torque. Opting for a turbocharged engine would have made these a little bit more responsive to power and additional modifications, which would make them a lot more fun on the streets, since there's not much to brag about the 7.6 second 0 to 62 mile an hour speeds that the Subaru BRZ is clocking. This is a naturally aspirated engine, so power gains aren't the easiest to come by, but don't you worry, despite me not saying the greatest things so far about this engine, we can actually add about 50 wheel horsepower for less than $2,000, and when we're talking about a 2,700 pound car that only comes with 205 horsepower from the factory, adding 50 wheel horsepower will make a significant difference into the quickness of this car, the acceleration, and overall will make it feel a lot more fun and a lot faster to drive. So in this video, we're going to talk about the bolt-on modifications that can take this Subaru BRZ and its 2-liter naturally aspirated engine and add approximately 50 wheel horsepower. The drivetrain losses are real on these engines, with a stock BRZ dynoing around 160 to 170 wheel horsepower. So with these modifications that we're going to talk about, we'll be able to take the BRZ to about 210 to 220 wheel horsepower with 5 simple modifications that are going to run you around $2,000. Before we get into this specific list of modifications, let's talk about the torque drop in the power band that the Subaru BRZ and its FA20 engine experience. There is a dreadful torque drop within the power band from 3,500 to 4,000 RPMs on these engines. What that does is make these cars feel very slow and sluggish in the mid-band when you're trying to accelerate more quickly. So in addition to adding 50 wheel horsepower, one of the things that we're also going to want to do is try to eliminate this mid-range torque drop, which is going to make your car feel a lot more powerful and a lot faster in that mid-range. So when it comes to modifications, the best modification here is going to be engine tuning, but I'm going to go ahead and save that for last on the list because there are a couple other considerations and modifications that we need to take into account to eliminate this torque dip, and that all is going to come down to tuning at the end of it. So first off, let's cover 2 of our most basic bolt-on modifications, with the first one being a cold air intake. The intake system on the BRZ is extremely restrictive, which is kind of odd to see in a naturally aspirated car. The good news here is that just upgrading the intake can add some pretty serious power gains on these cars, whereas on a typical naturally aspirated car, you're not going to see much more than 2 to 3 wheel horsepower from an intake. On the BRZ, if you do a full intake upgrade, you can actually get about 10 to 15 wheel horsepower power increases, which is phenomenal for a $300 to $400 intake. The intake does come in 2 pieces. There is the factory intake box and the factory intake piping, and then there is a separate piping that holds the mass airflow sensor as well. So to maximize power gains, you'll want to do a full upgrade and upgrade both of those pipes to see the 10 to 15 wheel horsepower gains. If you just stick with doing the intake and the first piece of intake piping, you'll likely see around 8 wheel horsepower gains. So adding the additional piece of piping can help get you another 5 wheel horsepower or so. With respect to intake upgrades, generally speaking, the intakes that offer the biggest power gains are going to be the ones from InGen, AEM, Perrin, Greddy, and agency power. Second modification that we want to talk about is the exhaust system. There are 3 components to the exhaust system on the BRZ. Starting from the front to the back, we have a front pipe, a mid pipe, which is usually called the over pipe on these engines, and then we have our catback exhaust system. The catalytic converter sits within the front pipe on these cars, and so naturally you might think removing the catalytic converter and upgrading that front pipe is going to give you the biggest power gains. However, the catback portion of this exhaust system is actually the most restrictive and offers the biggest power gains. Upgrading the catback is good for about 8 wheel horsepower and 5 wheel torque, but you still can upgrade the front pipe and the over pipe for additional power gains. However, the gains that you get from those pipes is a little bit smaller. If you delete the catalytic converter and go with test pipes and then also upgrade the over pipe, you can get about another 5 wheel horsepower out of exhaust system upgrades. Now, in my opinion, 5 wheel horsepower for deleting an emissions component and having to pay for 2 more pieces of the exhaust might not necessarily be worth it, especially considering the ramifications that come with it. And so in my opinion, just getting a good catback exhaust system and enjoying those power gains is a great option. So an intake and an exhaust are absolutely worth it, definitely recommended, but I separated these two on the list because the next 3 modifications that we talk about are going to be some of the best for eliminating the torque dip that we talked about, as well as adding some pretty solid power gains to get to that 210 to 220 wheel horsepower that I talked about. And all 3 of these components really come together with tuning at the end, which is why I'm covering that last. So now our 3rd modification is going to be a set of performance headers. The design of the factory exhaust manifold is one of the primary reasons for the 3,500 to 4,000 RPM torque dip. And so to eliminate that torque dip, we're going to need to get rid of the factory exhaust manifold and upgrade to headers. Doing this and getting rid of that torque dip is going to require proper tuning, but with a set of upgraded headers and proper tuning, we're going to eliminate that torque dip and we're going to add 10 wheel horsepower and about 8 wheel torque. You've got 2 options here. You can go with equal length or unequal length headers. It's really up to you on what you want to choose from a performance and power standpoint. There isn't a huge difference between the 2. Our 4th modification is going to be E85 or ethanol fueling. The BRZ has a very good fueling system from the factory and is 100% flex fuel capable, meaning you can run full E85 and reap the benefits of ethanol fueling. Now, ethanol fueling, or E85 specifically, has an octane rating of 100 to 105, depending on the ultimate ethanol content of the gas. And so when we compare that to the traditional 85 to 93 octane that you get from traditional pump gas, we have a significantly higher octane rating, which is a lot better for power and performance. You will notice a decrease in fuel economy from using ethanol fueling, but E85 gas is a lot more expensive than traditional gasoline, despite it being also a little bit harder to find. This is going to be one of the best modifications that can add up to 15 wheel horsepower and 15 wheel torque to the BRZ, and the good thing is it's completely free with proper tuning. To really maximize the benefits from E85 fueling, you'll want to be running a proper E85 tune. But outside having proper tuning for ethanol fueling, there are 0 other modifications that you need, and that makes this one of my favorite modifications for the BRZ. Saving the best for last is tuning. The reason I wanted to talk about this last is because tuning on its own isn't going to be a huge power driver for these engines. You'll likely see 8 to 12 wheel horsepower and maybe 10 to 15 wheel torque from tuning on an otherwise completely stock vehicle, but tuning is extremely important because we need it to fully eliminate the torque dip and we need it to run 100% E85 fueling. And so tuning is really the building blocks or the most important piece to getting these engines to actually add 50 wheel horsepower to get in that 200 plus wheel horsepower range. Ultimately, you're not going to want to stick with just a standard plug and play tuner here. You're going to want to make sure you work with a custom tuner to smooth out your power band as well as to be able to handle the full E85 that you're running. But when you factor in the headers, E85 fueling, and tuning, this is what's really going to give you 30, 35 plus wheel horsepower. So these 3 components are the biggest pieces to waking up the BRZ and making it a little bit more powerful and a lot more fun to drive around. But an intake and an exhaust system are absolutely still worth it, because those alone are still going to be able to give you 15 to 20 wheel horsepower, and both an intake and an exhaust system are each going to run you about $300 to $400. Ultimately, between an intake and exhaust, headers, and tuning, those are the only 4 modifications you need to buy, because E85 is free. You will be less than $2,000 into modifications on your BRZ, and you'll get a solid 50 plus wheel horsepower out of this, which, like I mentioned earlier, on a 2,700 pound car is a lot more than it is on any other car that's significantly heavier than that. Anyways, guys, going beyond these bolt-on modifications is when we need to start talking about forced induction, and there's a lot of other considerations that go into that, as well as kind of the power capabilities of these engines themselves. And so in this video, we're going to stick to these bolt-on modifications that will go a long way on the BRZ, and will save any forced induction conversations and power limits and more serious builds for a later video. If you guys appreciate this video, please click the like button, subscribe to our channel, and stay tuned for all our future content.